Now that we've heard about current trends, what's happening overall in terms of mobility, we want to now focus on Groupon and how they've navigated this dynamic environment, and in the end, how they formulated a global remote worker policy and framework that's integrated with a technology platform. My name is Sajjad Abedin. I'm a senior manager with GTN's Great Lakes region. I'm based in Chicago as well, and I've been working with Doug and the folks at Groupon for a number of years. Doug, thanks again for your time today. I want to start off by asking you to walk us through yours and Groupon's thought process regarding its remote employees.
Yeah, absolutely, Sajjad. First of all, thanks for having me join you for this. I'm still not 100% sure whether I've been asked here to represent Groupon because we have best practice to share, or if we're the cautionary tale of what you all should avoid. But in any event, I hope that what we have to share in our experiences are valuable as you navigate your own challenges through this space. And basically, our story began probably in the same place everyone else's back in the summer of last year, after all of our offices had been closed for a few months and our entire workforce had no choice but to work remotely for an extended period of time. We started to ask ourselves some fundamental questions that we hadn't really considered initially when we moved to a fully remote workforce. So, first of all, do we know where our people are? We had known of some anecdotal cases of coworkers who had moved to, say, Florida to be closer to family, or a couple of cases of people that we knew who had traveled internationally, but we had no idea how widespread it was. We also didn't know what risks the company was exposed to as a result of that, or if we were compliant with the relevant regulations. So the answers to all those questions were no. We didn't know any of those things, and so we needed to get our arms around the problem. So the first step we took was to do an all-employee survey, just to find out, just very basic, where are our people. And we had a really good response rate, so we felt comfortable that we had a handle on the question of, were people actually working from the state and country that we thought they were working from, or had they moved during the pandemic? The second step was really damage control. It was splitting those groups up and assessing what the most acute risks were. And GTN helped assess this step with us. We knew that there were particular countries and some employees that had been abroad for longer stretches of time with higher risk than others. But we decided to take a consistent approach and split the groups into those who were working from a different state versus those who were working from a different country, and communicated to those groups separately. Those working abroad, we told them they had to return back to their official country of work and gave them a deadline. For those working from different states, we made sure that they understood the tax implications, and we updated their tax withholding accordingly to reflect the state that they were actually physically present in. But that's kind of how we took care of the next step of kind of mitigating the acute risks that we had identified. And then the third step is really a question of, what do we do to make sure we don't end up in the same place we are right now 3 months from now? So how do we set the right expectation for future requests? How do we make sure that they are requests instead of people just doing it without asking or without telling anyone? So we set up a panel of cross-functional subject matter experts to review new cases, to make sure we were being consistent and transparent in the process, trying to balance flexibility for employees with also managing risk for the company. And in parallel, we were developing the guidelines and process for a more sustainable long-term solution. And that is what we've been working on for the last several months.
No, that's great. Thank you, Doug. David, could you move to the next slide, please? And so Doug has kind of teed it up for everyone, and this quite a complex process here. There's multiple pain points that the company was experiencing with this remote employees. Doug, it's quite unique here. I mean, you didn't really have a dedicated global mobility team, and it, just like a lot of the participants on the call here today, you're sitting in compensation and benefits, and it seems like global mobility function kind of it kind of came to you, whether it by design or not by design. Any thoughts on that and how you navigated that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there is no dedicated mobility team at Groupon. The Comp and Ben team does own our relocation policy. We manage our expat population. And so this remote work program basically fell to us. That said, we are not tax experts and we're not immigration experts. We're not experts on payroll regulations. And so we were in a position to be able to coordinate all of this activity, but we weren't in a position to really make sound decisions without a lot of input from others. And so we did, like I said, we got a cross-functional team together. It included representatives from the Comp and Ben team, from the HR team, from our corporate tax, legal, and immigration team. So all of these people, we met on a weekly basis, basically to assess new cases, talk through, making sure that we were, like I said, being consistent and trying to accommodate where we could for personal situations. But basically, it was the input of all those teams with the support from GTN, of course, to basically understand what the risks were, how we should think about the balance, and what we could do going forward from a more sustainable policy standpoint.
So you mentioned some of the departments and the stakeholders that have been involved in this process, and I hope that for everyone listening in here today or who've gone through potentially a remote worker program, the complexities behind it, the how time consuming it can be, costly. It's almost like an evolving process, if you will. You mentioned some things. Can you give us some commentary on how the company went about both internally, externally, the development of the policy, the actual framework in terms of overall global domestic approval, and the actual integration of the technology itself?
Yeah, for sure. So we took the approach of splitting it a couple of ways just to try to keep it simple. We wanted to look at the difference between domestic requests, requesting to work from a different city or state, versus inter-country requests, which get more complicated and have a lot more potential risks involved. And then we also wanted to split short-term versus long-term, which we defined as either 1 month or less or greater than 1 month. And so the approach that we've taken is that for any domestic requests under 30 days, we're not even going to have these come through the system. We don't want to lose the important signal in a lot of noise of people who are working for 2 or 3 weeks from a different state where the consequences are minimal. That's really been left up to the business to work with their HR business partner to determine if it's appropriate for the team and for the employee. And that's as far as we go with those short-term domestic requests. For the longer term domestic requests, we do route those through the technology solution that we put in place where it will route to the line manager and the HR business partner simultaneously so that they can coordinate to make sure that it makes sense from a business perspective. It could also route to an immigration partner if the employee is on a visa, and then there's a final business approver, but we don't actually have anyone else involved outside of HR in the business. For international cases, this is where things get a lot more complicated, where we want to make sure that we're looking at it through the lens of different potential risk factors. And so in addition to the process I outlined for domestic cases, we also have a series of those subject matter experts who we also want to review and weigh in on the potential risks of any nuances with the country combinations involved. So we do have legal, corporate tax, and immigration involved, as well as the C&B team, to basically weigh all of those risks and, if necessary, get the group together to discuss them before that's approved. So that's the approach we've taken. Again, because there's so much complexity and so much nuance between what it might mean for an individual case, depending on the employee's situation, depending on the combination of countries that are involved. It's so complicated, but we wanted to try to keep it as simple as possible so that it's a manageable process.
It's interesting to note here, and this is obviously from the outside looking in, working with Groupon, it seems like, obviously there's starting at the top of the policy and with the framework and the technology, it seems like there's also been a common realization that, there has to be some type of flexibility just in terms of potential obstacles that may come in place, just like with anything that may come through. And it's interesting to note that Groupon has been fairly receptive to that. And then that's one thing, hopefully, that everyone can understand, is that this is something that it's not something that can fit in a nice, clean box. Things are going to be black and white. There's going to be some gray areas that we all at Groupon as a company, within the stakeholders, and us as an external provider have to truly, in full transparency, be flexible with. Anything to add with that, Doug? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say balancing that flexibility with the reality of the risks, and I think a big challenge has been communicating that in a way that can be understood by employees and by managers, because it is so complicated. So we like Sajad said, we want to be flexible, we want to accommodate where we can, but there are cases where we've taken a really firm stance, and it's been a difficult process to get everybody on board with that. So one example would be in India, where we've identified a heightened risk of permanent establishment risk, and we do have a number of Indian nationals working in other countries, in Ireland, in the U.S., and this process really uncovered that there was a past practice of employees getting approval from their managers to go travel back to India over the holidays to see family and work remotely from India. And this has been just kind of a common past practice that we essentially didn't really know about. And because of this heightened risk, we've taken the stance that we can't accommodate any remote work for the time being from India. And that's been kind of a real challenge to get people to understand why it's different from what was told in the past. We've also got some people who traveled there in 2020 and either got stuck because of travel bans or because of visa appointments being canceled. And so, it can look inconsistent on the surface, and having to explain all these nuances is a real challenge.
Oh, that's great, and appreciate the insights there. I think that's a good segue to the next part of our discussion here, was the actual case studies. We are going to discuss 3 case studies that were actual life cases that Groupon had to review, analyze. We would discuss some of the facts, what the ended up results were, and then also looking at each case and how the company utilized the whereabouts technology to make an informed decision for that particular case. The first case here is an international one, where an Irish-based employee requested to work remotely in Indonesia, more for personal reasons, to care for family members. It was going to be for up to 6 months, but within that 6 months, there was going to be a request to work for 2 weeks in Indonesia. The important thing to note here is that Groupon does not have an entity in Indonesia, but the employee did not have abilities to act on behalf of the company in Ireland, could not initiate contracts, was not at an executive level type position. It ended up being that the interesting part of this case here is that the company didn't have an entity in Indonesia. There's exposure there, not just from an income tax perspective, but from the employer side of things. And while it was noted that this case did get approved here, Doug, can you expand on your decision-making process and how the company went about it in making a decision, while we also will look at the whereabouts technology in terms of review and approval?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the interesting takeaway from this particular case was the fact that we have identified a couple of countries of heightened risk where I mentioned the India one as an example, where we are not permitting any remote work despite our desire to be as flexible as we can. And Indonesia was not one of the countries on that list. It's one where if the request was short term, it could slip through our process without too much scrutiny. But this is a reminder for us that there are countries out there that could have heightened risk. Things could change, regulations change, enforcement of regulations can change, and so we do need to make sure that we are staying agile and flexible in our policy, not just in how we have set it up in the first place. It's going to have to be something that we continue to monitor and watch for these countries where there might be additional risks that we haven't identified. There's no way we can do all of that work up front to make a decision on where our risk tolerance is for every single country combination before we launch the policy. But we are going to have to monitor this very closely going forward and be ready to make changes as appropriate. In this case, we were able to accommodate it given the short-term nature of the work period of 2 weeks, and given the specific circumstances of the why behind it. But as Sajad said, the entire trip, the amount of physical presence in the country that we don't have a legal entity in, was a fact pattern that did make us pause and did make us look deeper into it before we approved it.
Yeah, and thanks for speaking to that, Doug, and hi, everyone. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Andrew Ingaldo. I'm a senior here at GTN. I work closely with Sajad and David over the past 2 years, helping companies manage their business travel and remote work populations. I'm based in San Diego, so I'm out on the West Coast, but it's nice to meet everyone. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the request form that employees will fill out when they're requesting a remote work arrangement, such as this individual working in Ireland who's requesting to go home to Indonesia for a brief period. So essentially, this individual has an employee profile within our whereabouts technology that includes demographic details such as their tax residency, domicile, things of that nature. And then that profile, in combination with the corporate structure and other guidelines that Groupon has worked to integrate into the technology, in combination with this request form, will provide alerts and highlight any risks that might need to be considered here. So the request form is pretty simple. You just enter the destination city that you're going to. So this individual will be going to Jakarta, Indonesia. For the 2-week work period, we'll include that period as the requested period. The trip kind will be just a remote worker. There's a few other options here based on what the individual situation is. If they have a applicable visa to work in the requested location, that will pop up here. The purpose, parent purpose would be technical, and then this will drive the option selected here, which for this arrangement is simply remote working, continuing my usual role. A few additional questions that Groupon specifically added into this request is, have you recorded fully your time spent outside of your home location on tool? So as Doug was mentioning, within the Groupon remote work policy, there's this general threshold of the 1 month period for the long term, short term. And this question is just to ensure that any of this individual's previous travel, whether that be before whereabouts was in place or just it wasn't loaded into the tracker tool, just to confirm that any of that travels in this tool so we can get a full picture of the individual's travel and risks. Do you have the legal right to work in this country? Simple yes or no. This individual is an Indonesian national, so that'll be a yes. Are you currently on a work visa? No. And then just some additional reasoning for the remote work request, just to provide some additional context for the applicable reviewers. And then simply agreeing to having read the Groupon global remote worker policy, and that this request is simply a request and it might not be approved.
One thing just to point out, there was a drop down for continuing my usual role, and it was the only option. Just to point out, this system will also be used for business travel as well eventually, and so being able to track both of those together and see a full picture of time spent in a country, but it might seem a little strange to just have the drop down for one option at this point. So it's something that we're going to be building on and scaling as we go.
Right. Thanks, Doug. And then just to highlight what essentially this does is this remote work request is created, and then the system generates alerts based on the applicable risks of the country combination, the employee profile, and Groupon's corporate profile within the technology. And it suggests, specific risks that might want to be looked at, and then the approval process is built in as well. So just to highlight a couple of the alerts, based on your tax residency, there's no comprehensive double tax treaty in place with the country. So Ireland and Indonesia don't have a double tax treaty. And additionally, there's no social security agreement in place. Those are two kind of heightened factors here that may increase the risk substantially. But then, as Doug was mentioning, if you want to speak to this, Doug, just the approvals, as you were talking about, the different tiers for the different level of request, that's in here as well for the approvers.
Yeah, so based on the short-term nature of this request, under 1 month, this is being routed just to the business, along with the HR business partner for approval. The benefits team is listed there as well. They get a notification, and that's just for them to be aware that this is happening. In case there are any potential benefits consequences, are they going to lose coverage when they are somewhere where their benefits don't cover them. So it's a simple approval for short term and for domestic cases. We're trying to keep it as flat as possible and keep the decision making as decentralized as possible until we see a greater risk that needs to be looked at more closely.
Thanks, Doug and Andy, for discussing that case study. I hope everyone can appreciate while it was a short term in nature, that the complexities of that case, the gray areas that confronted Groupon and the employee, and the potential exposure for both as well too, and what the likely logical results would be. Moving on to the next case study, we wanted to highlight a U.S. domestic case request that actually came up. And Groupon is headquartered in the state of Illinois, specifically in Chicago. And it's very common for many people that live in some of the bedroom communities in Northwest Indiana to live in Indiana and commute every day to Chicago. And so there's a decent population of employees that did that for Groupon. And obviously with the pandemic, that changed, where people were working from home. And so this brought up an issue where these individuals were staying in their homes, and created more of a sensitivity for the company overall, where they had other employees working remotely in other states where they may not be certain agreements that avoid potential double taxation or provide some type of tax relief. It's what it's referred to as reciprocal agreements between states. It also shows the nature that while in terms of remote work, a lot of attention is placed on the global scale, which it should, but the states here in the U.S. have their own rules for the ones that assess individual income tax. And each state has their own rules and complexities in this era of the time of uncertainty, the need for additional tax revenue, budgetary deficits within these states. The states have taken have become at the forefront of remote work. It's actually come up as high in our own judicial system here, where it went up to the Supreme Court, where they actually this year refused to hear a case between the states of New Hampshire and Massachusetts regarding remote work. So it really has placed a lot of attention from a state perspective. In this case here, there was some sensitivity regarding these individuals who were working in Indiana. who were living in Indiana, but were based technically in Illinois. And Doug, can you add to how the company went about this? What was their process? Some of the levels of sensitivity, and how they looked at it from a company-wide perspective, and not just these two states.
Yeah. So for me, I think the big takeaway on this one for me was the decision that we made around whether or not we wanted to have employees opt in versus opt out of making a change to their tax withholding. So when we had done that survey to find out where everybody was physically located last year, we wanted to kind of quickly get things cleaned up and not take a lot of time to get resolution to that. And so we did an opt-out approach, where we basically informed employees who were working from a different state, we are going to change your tax withholding to reflect the state that you're physically present in on this date, unless you tell us that you don't want us to for some reason. And so that was just a sweeping, decentralized decision that we made. It worked exactly as intended. But going forward, we know that people's individual tax circumstances can be nuanced. We don't want to make those decisions for employees, but we do want to make sure that they're making informed decisions. And so the approach we've taken is an opt-in approach. If we have any cases where employees are requesting to work remotely from a different state for more than 30 days, we're basically informing them, if it's approved, that's great, go do it. But please consider the fact that there are tax consequences. You may have a requirement to file in that state. You may have a requirement to withhold in that state if you don't want to have a cash flow issue at the end of the year. And so we advise them to consult with a personal tax advisor and give them instructions on how to change their tax withholding if that's the approach they want to take. So that's the approach we've taken. Like Sajad said, this isn't just an Indiana, Illinois issue. We have employees working from all over the U.S. and we've got one case in particular that's a little bit trickier, where we have somebody commuting between the Bay Area and Seattle. And so, these are cases that will continue to pop up. And I think our approach will consistently be to inform and advise rather than to just take the action unilaterally.
Right. And just to highlight a little bit about the request form in this case, it would be the same general process for the start and end date. We're just going to set it for a year from now, just to kind of portray that permanent, I can't think of the word, permanent nature of the request. And then same parent purpose, technical, remote working, continuing my usual role. As Doug mentioned, that's just what we're showing here for the specific remote work request. As Groupon's policy evolves and begins to cover business travel and extends to that population, these options will change, and there will be further options to more accurately reflect the work that we'll be doing in that case. Just the same questions down here. Have you recorded your time? Are you on a work visa? Specify the reason, just to give some additional context. I live in Indiana. The individual would just create that pre-trip, and then these alerts would be generated the same as before. And it states a payroll tax residency review should be conducted because your work state is different from your destination state, and you'll begin to accumulate time in that state as well. And just to point out these little actions here, an individual employee obviously won't see these and be able to act in these items, but individual reviewers, when they come in and perform their reviews and analyses before, while providing their approvals or denials for the specific request, they have the option to just come up here and note that this specific review was completed, and the ability to add notes, whatever you'd like to say if there's any note in there. And just to highlight again, these alerts, the process we built with Groupon, configuring this technology for their specific approval process for this remote work request. When this individual creates this request, these alerts are then sent out to the appropriate approvers via email, and they're provided with an email link to this case, and they're provided all the relevant information they need to review and assess the case in an efficient and centralized way. So Doug or Sajad, do you have anything else to touch on this piece in whereabouts or any other facts related to this case?
Not in this one. Nope.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think we can move on to the third and final case study. Thanks, Andy. So our last case study, we wanted to kind of touch on an actual request that had both an international and domestic aspects to it. It was a U.S.-based employee who requested to work in Puerto Rico, and it was on a permanent basis. Again, the company does not have a legal entity there. The individual is not at an executive level or at a type of role where they would have decision-making authority or can initiate contracts. So that made the decision a bit more straightforward for the company. But again, where this kind of ties from both an international and domestic perspective is Puerto Rico is part of the U.S., but it has its own set of rules, not just tax rules, from a payroll perspective as well, too. And the company kind of had to navigate. In the end, this did get approved, but the company had to navigate on how both they and the employee would be compliant from both the U.S. payroll and Puerto Rican payroll income and tax perspective. And so, Doug, can you care to share more insights on this individual case here?
Yeah, this one's fun because in this case, we have the Puerto Rican government actually putting out a marketing website encouraging people to come and bring their laptops and work from Puerto Rico. And so it's this official government website that says, bring your laptop, come work from the beach. We have great Wi-Fi. And so that basically, obviously people are going to see that and say, this is an official Puerto Rican government website. It's fine for me to just pack my bags and go to Puerto Rico. And it's a real challenge then to be the guy who has to say, well, actually, it's more complicated than that, and trust me and my vast tax knowledge over what you're reading on the official government website. So it's not easy. They make it much more difficult for us. And Puerto Rico is not the only government that has done this. I've seen a handful of cases where there are these smaller countries that are like trying to bring people in and to get some buzz around a tourist buzz or remote work buzz to get people in. And it is a challenge because there are other considerations. The agencies that put these things out are not always in sync with all of the other agencies and treaties and regulations, and so it really is a challenge then to be able to convince people that there are other layers of complexity that need to be considered. Luckily, in this case, we were able to accommodate, so we didn't have a protracted fight on our hands with the employee to try to convince them that we actually had some merit to what we were saying. But it was more complicated and required weighing the risks more closely than it would appear by looking at the website that I mentioned.
Yeah, so thanks, Doug. Just to touch on a few other pieces here within the request form, it's the same request form. We're going to do it for a year, again, to signal that it's going to be a permanent move for the time being. Going to answer the same questions similarly. And then, as you can see, as opposed to the other previous two requests, there's definitely a lot more layers of review with this specific request since there's the international piece and it's over 30 days. So, Doug, do you want to hit on the additional approvals that'll be required for this one?
Yeah, and I'll also say that this is interesting because generally speaking, we would not be approving permanent arrangements outside of the locations where we don't have a legal entity. Obviously, like payroll withholding requirements, that we can't comply with those. Generally speaking, Puerto Rico is an interesting exception given the fact that it is a territory, and so like this is a case that I don't know that we'll ever see a case like it again. But because of the nature of Puerto Rico, we basically were able to clarify in our policy before we roll it out that only like that U.S. territories would basically qualify as an inter-country move within the policy rather than a domestic move because the fact pattern is just more closely aligned to international than domestic. So in this case, it will be approved by the business, but also the subject matter experts, legal, tax, and immigration.
Great. Thanks, Doug and Andy, for that. Andy, could you move to the next slide, please? So, looking at discussing the overall remote worker program, going through some case studies that the company actually had to work through. We had just touched on earlier, the various pain points that the company was experiencing. And how in place policy has been developed, framework is in place in terms of global and domestic review and approval, and there's a technology that has been integrated and configured within the company's systems. And so to look at the evolutionary nature of this type of program, this is still a work in progress. Doug, can you touch on where the remote worker program, it's endearingly known as Project Nomad. Where does the project stand right now?
Yes, we are at a very exciting point here with the project. First of all, we're going to be no longer in Google Sheets tracking all of this stuff manually. We've got the system configured now to our specifications. We have all of our communications plan ready to roll out. We've done our training. We have approval from the business and from our works council. So everything is just hinged now on waiting for our communications team to figure out exactly when the right place to plug it into all of our other communications will be. But we'll be rolling out the policy and the process here probably in the next week. So it's really exciting. As I said before, this is probably just the beginning as we now have it live, and we will hopefully move our cadence of meetings from weekly to monthly to just monitor our ongoing open cases and to start working on our management reporting. I think over time we'll definitely need to see what's working and what's not, see what the evolution of the regulations in this space are, and just continue to iterate on what we've built.
So Doug, let me jump in. I've had a question from the audience, which just fits right in. It says, how many requests have come through compared to total population? I think really what you're saying is it hasn't officially gone live. So these case studies that we've been working on have been happening as the tool and the process has been built out. So just didn't know if you had any other comments or if I stated that accurately.
So the number of requests, like percentage of employees, I would have to guess it's probably been something around 5% or so. That's probably roughly what we've seen. That includes a lot of the people though who were just remote before we even had a process in place. So 5, maybe a little bit more than 5%.
Great, thanks.
Oh, great.
Sorry, Sajad. There are some more questions from the audience. So if you want me to go through those now, or Sajad, did you have anything to add before I hijack it with questions?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to recap here with the next slide here is, we've been talking about how this is, Doug was kind of poking fun at this early at the beginning of this presentation, is that we wanted to show like a more of a transparent, unvarnished, look at how this works. And with this evolutionary or evolving aspect of the process is the reporting side of it. Once this process is, once the overall program goes live with its employee population and its stakeholders, we're currently in the process of working with Groupon on its reporting. Hopefully, potentially from a format, maybe with a dashboard, whatever is customizable that fits the company's needs and how they can make well-informed decisions and using that information to its most capabilities and as useful as possible. With that, I want to hand it back to David to discuss any kind of questions that have been coming up.
Thanks, Chad, and thanks, Doug and Andy as well. I think that was excellent. That even went better than rehearsal. Well done. Very impressive. Thank you. Jen's been fielding the questions as they've come in. So Jen, without bouncing around too much, I'll hand over to you to start those ones.
Sure, although I see Lynn has figured out how to raise her hand. So Lynn, did you have a comment?
My hand raising function is back, so I'm back on screen and everything. Can I ask a question that relates to the last question before we get to all that? We've gotten quite a few questions, but the question really related to how many people have requested and it really is sort of a broad trend question, Doug, too, is, I'm sort of seeing the future of work, that this is, remote work is here to stay, hybrid work or remote work is here to stay. As people get more comfortable, you're likely to see more of it. You said about 5%. Have you seen an uptick in the request? Are you anticipating that this is a trend? And maybe this is also a question for the folks at GTN. Is this something that is growing? Is this the future of work?
Yeah, a great question. And I guess one thing to clarify before I answer the question would be, and hopefully this was clear, or at least implicit in all of this, is that this whole process is really directed towards temporary requests. So I want to go work from California for 30 days. I want to go work from Ireland for 2 weeks. Not, I don't ever want to come back to the office again. My family's moving to Portland. Can I do that? And so that's completely separate. And that is really mostly a business decision of, can this role be fully remote? Is this employee a strong performer, and can I trust them to be fully remote? Is the nature of the job and the team, does that support remote work on a long-term basis? And so that is kind of a separate question, and that definitely does require things like, do we have a legal entity there? Whereas for this being a temporary arrangement, I intend to continue to work from Illinois, but I want to be in Florida for a month. So that's really the piece that we're focusing on with this technology. And in terms of, do I expect an uptick? I definitely expect an uptick in remote work in general. Whether there will be a great uptick in the temporary requests, I'm not sure. I think that maybe once we return to the office, there will be fewer people who are living and working from somewhere else temporarily. I don't think we'll know until we actually walk the path here, but I suspect that there are some people doing it right now who aren't requesting it or aren't telling us because we don't have a formal process in place yet. So once we communicate the policy and the process, we'll see what happens. But I think there may be some trade-offs between the people who were doing it under the radar before, who now come to the surface, and then the people who, once we return to office, no longer are moving around as much as they were.
Great, thank you.
And Lynn, sorry, just to give a slightly different or an additional view, and what Doug said is actually spot on. When we started discussing this with Doug, it was much more the focus on business travel, and then it sort of pivoted and changed, obviously, from last year into remote work. And the technology, the tool we have actually was designed for business travel. So we've adapted and amended that specifically for remote work. So it still has a business travel function as well. I'm not going to get into all the detail of that and do case studies, but the idea behind that is this is the whole sort of future of the workforce, which I think you mentioned, is you're going to have a much more mobile employee base. There's going to be those 100% in office, those 100% remote, and then that sort of hybrid model in between, which are going to be different types of mobile employee. Well, how on earth is a company going to? You're either going to restrict it. We're already seeing lots of companies say, "Hey, people are working from anywhere. You can come and join us and work from anywhere." And then in very small print and sort of whispering, as long as it's only in these countries and these states, and so and it's almost, which is great, which is fine. But then I think it's how do companies track, locate, and manage those? So this is one functionality of one technology, and not being too salesy, there's other technologies out there as well. But there's definitely a move to sort of use technology to help reduce that amount of admin internally.
Which leads perfectly into the first question that we had, was that from an equity standpoint, do all employees who can effectively work remotely have the option of putting through a request? And I think the answer to that is yes, but I'll defer to you, Doug.
Yes, that's correct. We do have the 30-day limit for outside your country. Now we will review exception requests for that depending on the circumstances, but the 30-day limit is our international limit on that.
I didn't even tell him, but that was part 2 of the question, was what the time limit is. So good job.
Sorry, I'm cheating. I'm looking at the questions.
A couple more here, and then our.
Sorry, can I add one, Doug? Just to make sure with the policy here, there is some restrictions on the countries just based on what the companies decided for risk level as well. Too. It was I believe India and Canada. So just wanted to add.
And the U.S. Yep. In
the U.S. Yes.
And Jen, just before you move on, because I just want to, I know we're sort of adding on, it's the worst thing to do, but I just want to give you everyone a slight, 30 days seems to have been the number of days that the majority of corporates have landed on. Again, that's a commercial decision based on risk tolerance internally. That's not necessarily the statutory requirement. That's my tax hat on. Some companies are pushing 60. You're into the economic employer argument by that point. Some have gone to 90, and I've seen some use the 182 days, which I think is very aggressive, given the direction of travel of the tax authorities and immigration, etc. So I think most have settled on that sort of 30 days as being low risk. Just want to give you a sense of the market as well.
And folks, we have quite a few questions, so when we have about 5 minutes, why don't we get through as many as we can, and then if there are any left over, I'll send them to you all, and you all can respond, and we'll get right back to the person.
Perfect. So moving on with that, I think a couple of these are combined. So one of them is are the tax implications? Is the responsibility of the employee, of company, or is Groupon providing any support?
Well, there are likely tax implications that affect both the company and the employee, and based on employee tax consequences, those would be the employee's responsibility, generally speaking, but we would want to advise them and give them kind of line of sight to what we see as the potential employee obligations so that they are aware of what they're getting themselves into.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. A couple of these are on compensation and benefits, so let's answer those real quick. So the member asked if Groupon has made compensation adjustments for people looking for long-term or permanent moves, for example, from a high cost of living to a one that's a lower cost.
That's a great question. It's something we wrestled with internally for a long time and went back and forth on. We historically have had a policy of paying and adjusting based on cost of labor in different states across the U.S. And that was our going in stance, given it had been our historical practice. But we actually have made the decision to not make adjustments for internal employees if they're moving from Chicago to another location. So we'll basically let them move with their existing salary if their permanent move is approved. We do have another office in Seattle, which is a higher cost of labor area than Chicago. So anybody moving from Seattle would have an adjustment down to that Chicago floor. But we've taken the stance and the change to basically set that floor.
Great, thank you. And the last one with comp and benefits was how does a remote worker program tie to their healthcare benefits? Example, medical coverage, and what challenges have you faced?
We haven't faced any specific challenges with this yet, but we are aware that there could be limitations on coverage depending on where the employee is going from and to. And so this is why we have in our process a notification to our benefits team to basically be able to weigh in and advise on any risks, both with respect to medical and other coverage. So we want to just make sure that if there could be a gap in coverage, that we're identifying that before somebody actually makes a move.
Great. And I think the last question that I have so far that I can see is how do you plan to monitor compliance with the remote work policy? For example, if they don't return on time, or if they do return on time.
Yeah, this is the big one. So great question. I don't know that we have a great answer for it, but basically we have tried to sneak some language into the policy that suggests that if you don't return by the date that you've agreed to return by, that we could consider that job abandonment, and it could lead to disciplinary action up to termination. We try to balance that with not being too threatening about it, because we don't want this to seem like we're overbearing, but we do need people to return to where they're supposed to be. And so we are really relying on managers to confirm these things. We are currently, before we introduce this technology, we have been emailing employees to confirm if they returned by the date that they said they would be back by. But once we launch the actual tool, it's pretty clear that managers have that responsibility to keep people accountable to what they've agreed to.
Excellent, thank you. And the last question was if we will provide copies of the presentation. And so I had said yes, we'll give those to Lynn so that she can email them out to the members or make them available. And we actually covered all the questions, Lynn.
Great, thank you very, very much. Terrific presentation. I can't thank you all enough for the work that you did behind the scenes to bring the discussion to our folks that have joined us. And I will send the presentation to everyone who registered, and then I will post it on our website under the members only section as well. We do have a number of other presentations coming up in the near future, so be on the outlook for those as well. We'll be doing some short deep dives on topics that we'll be sending out to those folks that are interested. If you're not a member of the committee but would like to also be a member of the committee, please let me know that as well. And I thank all of our speakers. I thank Mike and Richard for their work that they did behind the scenes to bring the topic up and to discuss it and help me get the right folks, the great speakers that we have. And just really appreciate, Doug, your sharing your experience with all these other employers and all of your insights from the folks at GTN. So thank you all so much. I am giving you half a minute unless Mike gets the last word.
No, not at all. Thanks so much, Lynn. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, again, thank you, GTN, and thank you, Groupon. This is a fascinating topic and really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks
Very
for
much.
having me.
Everybody
Everybody look for the next announcement. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.